Hi, it's Myra here. Thank you for joining me for this edition of Storytime. Today's book is called The Dancing Cats of Applesap by Janet Taylor, however you pronounce her last name. Lyle, I would guess. This is a cute little story. I'll read you the inside cover. It says, Jig's drugstore had cats in the worst possible way, all over everything by the dozen, in amongst the comic books, on counters, underfoot. Outsiders thought the scene was odd, unnerving. Melba Morris, age 10, was an insider, one of only 3 people who still darkened the door of the already dim pharmacy in Applesap, New York. And Melba knew that the cats weren't odd at all, merely misunderstood. Sorry. "They're bewitched!" exclaimed one woman when she saw the cats dance, 100 felines prancing and twirling to the music of Mr. Jig's guitar. Another spectator summoned the local Humane Society and had them imprisoned. People feared that ragtag dancers were rabid, hazard, and a menace. They feared the cats' joy. Only Melba knew that those cats were a miracle, for Jig's drugstore nearly out of business, for the shy Twan of Applesap. Twan. What is a Twan? Where's it at? Right there. Twan. What's a Twan? I'll have to look that up. Twan of Applesap, squeezed between the Brazier towns of Glowville and Hopsburg, and barely able to come up with a road sign in its own defense. A miracle, too, for Miss Tooney, whose sweet hot fudge sundaes were dished up with sour remarks, and for the secretly musical Mr. Jiggs. But most important, the dancing was a miracle for shy Melba herself as, gulping hard, she saved the cats and dared to tell their tale to the Guinness Book of World Records and hence to the whole world. I'm going to start by reading a couple of here, I'll show you the front cover first. There's the front cover. See, that's inside the drugstore and the kitty cats are up dancing. And it's called The Dancing Cats of Applesap. Some more kitties there. Kitty cats. One there. This was wrote in, let's see, it's copyrighted 1984. You tell the story, says Melba Morris, sitting down in a living room chair by the Morris family telephone. No, you tell it, say I, a friend of the Morris family, more or less, and otherwise not someone who was involved. If I tell the story, you'll just end up interrupting me all the time, I pointed out. You're the one who's in it. You tell it anyway, answers Melba. I'm not very good at telling stories in front of people. You start and I'll listen, I promise. Well, all right, I say. I guess I've heard enough about these cats by now to begin anyhow. How about this? Once upon a time there was a girl who... Not that way, interrupts Melba immediately. See, I say, somewhat resentfully. There you go, interrupting. But you've got to tell the people how to get here first, exclaims Melba. Tell them what I always say whenever anyone asks me how to get to Applesap, New York. Okay, I prepared to start off again. But I know I won't get far with Melba sitting over there waiting to catch me up. Not that I mind, really. The best stories are built that way. One person starts talking, and then another person decides that something was left out and has to speak up and change things. Then another person says, no, it happened like this. And so, slowly, the story gets beaten into shape. I guess this story is going to be that sort, with Melba doing the beating into shape. Right, says Melba from her chair. Now go on and start telling. Don't pay any attention to me. I've got a phone call to make. Chapter 1. Whenever anybody asks Melba Morris where Applesap, New York is, this is what she says. If you've got a pen, it's easy. Have you got one? A thumbtack is okay too. My brother, Victor, did it once with a jackknife from all the way across the kitchen. He's a wild man. See, all you do is take your pen, or thumbtack, or jackknife, squint your eyes a little, and stick it, pow, in the middle of the map of New York State. That's where Applesap is, right at dead center. You can't miss it. Applesap is the town where Melba Morris lives. Lately, plenty of people have been asking for it. Word has got out about the pin, too. Now folks from Tennessee and Nebraska and Texas and all over everywhere are sticking pins in and finding out how to get there. Why, just last week a family came all the way from Alaska. California, Melba interrupts. They were from California. Well, then California. Just last week a family came all the way from California. Melba was proud of that. She had a right to be proud. It wasn't so long ago that nobody ever asked where Applesap was. Nobody knew there was an Applesap to ask for. And even if they had known, they wouldn't have cared. Applesap is the kind of town that is all right if you live smack in it, but otherwise doesn't amount to very much. It isn't the capital of anything. No presidents or beauty queens were ever born there. The only theater in town plays old Walt Disney movies that change about twice a year. Applesap is a quiet town, a shy town, a town that feels its smallness and doesn't like to speak up because there are so many bigger and louder towns around. When there's a shopping mall up for grabs, or a roller rink, something big like that, it gets built in Cloville in the north or in Hopsburg to the south. They've got weight and throw it around. Applesap has a couple of schools, a library, a grocery store, a ladies' dress shop, and 2 drugstores. Not what you would call weight in this day and age. Recently, though, there have been a run on Applesap. More people, tourist types, come by in one weekend than used to pass through in an entire year. And they're not coming all this way to get hot fudge sundaes at the Super Queen Drugs, Melba pipes up from her chair across the room. No, sir, they're coming straight to Jig's drugstore. Why, we're killing the Super Queen these days. I heard the owners are thinking of selling out and moving to Gloville where the competition isn't so rough. Miss Tooney's dancing cats are the main attraction, of course. There was a lady here yesterday from Hartford, Connecticut, who said the cats ought to be in the Guinness Book of World Records. And that's what that's Miss Tooney, Mr. Jiggs, and I, ought to be in too, for getting the act in shape. I thought that was a good idea, so I'm calling up the Guinness place this very morning. That's why I'm on the phone. I do things like that all the time now. Melba Morris is 10 years old, and she used to be just as shy and small and afraid to speak up as Applesap itself. At school she was the one in the thick tortoise-shell glasses, sitting furthest back from the teacher. On the playground you would see her off by herself, poking sticks through the fence or something equally dumb. She didn't like to walk up and say hello to anybody, even someone smaller than she was. Melba looked at her feet a lot, and rubbed her skinny elbow a lot, and if anyone, by mistake, said hello to her, she would run to the ladies' room to polish her glasses. All her life she had been that way. It could have come from having an older brother who was a wild man. Some people say if there is one child in a family who talks big and shows off and keeps a party jumping, there is bound to be another one who does the opposite. There's another picture. That's Melba sitting there. Maybe Melba was the opposite one, or maybe she was born shy and would have been shy no matter what. It's hard to say. In any case, most kids hardly knew she existed, even the kids in her class at Applesap Elementary School. Melba didn't complain. She said she liked being alone. She said she liked being ignored, and didn't mind in the least that she was the only girl in the class who didn't get invited to Irma Herring's Easter party. It's okay, Melba told her mother. I don't like Melba Herring anyway. I don't like Irma Herring anyway. Even when it turned out that she had been invited, and that the invitation had somehow gotten lost in the mail, Melba said she would rather not go. Why not? Said Melba's mother. Maybe if you went, those children would get to know you better. Everybody has a streak of shyness in them, Melba's father said. Everybody finds it hard to get to know people. Melba shook her head. She went up to her room and closed the door. In those days, Melba spent a good deal of time in her room. Heaven knows what she did in there. So sorry. Perhaps she read books, exciting adventures of ancient princesses or of children marooned on desert islands. No, I didn't, interrupted Melba. I didn't like stories. Nobody I know of was ever marooned on a desert island. Maybe she built scale models of rocket ships and blasted them out her window. Absolutely not, she declares. Victor would have done something like that. Well, then perhaps she was teaching herself to knit. But whatever it was, she was doing a lot of it in her room. The only other place she ever went was to Jig's drugstore, which under normal circumstances wouldn't have gotten her very far. Under normal circumstances she might have kept on going to Jig's and kept on being as shy as Applesap, New York, until both of them turned into dust. But of course, circumstances at Jig's were not normal. They sure weren't, said Melba now, sitting down to make her phone call to the Guinness book. Jig's drugstore didn't look like much on the surface, I know, but underneath it had potential. By the way, she adds, I was not knitting in my room. I was thinking. Chapter 2. Jig's drugstore is located around the corner from the elementary school on Dunn Street. No one in those days before the dancing cats would have guessed it had potential. When Melba started going there, it was a run-down place, and people didn't much go into it anymore. On rainy days at Jig's, the roof leaked into buckets set out on the floor, and on sunny days the air turned hot and buggy, and on any day the candy was stale. Furthermore, there were the cats. Not one or two cats curled up in out-of-the-way corners, not even 5 or 6 scampering after a ball of string. No, Jig's had cats in the worst possible way, all over everything by the dozen. They slept in piles, dangling their tails down the cosmetic cases. They prowled in droves around the bottoms of the cigar and candy racks. They licked their nails on top of the comic books and cleaned their ears behind the cash register. Whenever a customer came into the store, cat faces looked out from every crook and cranny to see who it was. Cat eyes blinked and stared, and 100 cat tails twitched. It was unnerving, to say the least. Most children who wanted a soda or a candy bar after school went over to the Super Queen Drugs 2 streets down. The Super Queen was new and fresh and didn't have any cats at all. The Super Queen had 2 spotless curving counters, flanked by rows of comfortable stools. It was the best place in town to meet up with people, and that, of course, was why Melba started going to Jig's, where she could order a hot fudge sundae without having to polish her glasses all the time. Jig's had only 4 battered chrome stools and flies. They stuck onto the counter where Mrs. Tooney hadn't sponged off. Miss Tooney was the dried-up old scrap of a lady who ran the soda fountain. She had worked in Jig's for years and looked half cat herself. Here's another picture of the drugstore. I don't know if that's focusing or not, but hopefully it is. Where are we at? Miss Tooney's mouth was edged with whiskers. Her hair fuzzed up the slope of her forehead like fur. On top of this, she was extremely ill-tempered. You couldn't say 2 words to Miss Tooney without getting your head snapped off. She was a grouch. Everybody in town said so, and all on account of some man who had asked her to marry him 4 years ago, and then had run off and left her flat-footed, without even an engagement ring to show for it. After that, Miss Tooney wouldn't have anything to do with men. Eventually she put women on her blacklist too. Children, being the natural result of both men and women, made her cross just to look at. The only creature Miss Tooney could stand were cats, and that is why so many had come to live at Jig's drugstore. There they were, a beat-up, cringing crowd, everyone which she'd found out on the Applesap streets. From the brink of starvation she had nursed them back to health, or from half freezing to death, or from mutilation by cars. Every monstrous thing that had ever been done to a cat had been done to the cats in Jig's drugstore, and this made Miss Tooney crosser than ever. Cast out upon the world by people who called themselves human beings, Melba heard her growl more than once under her breath. Miss Tooney was so furious at the way the world was treating cats that by the time Melba started going to Jig's, she wasn't talking to anyone, especially not to Mr. Jiggs, owner of the store, and a sad specimen in his own right. Spineless, Miss Tooney called him, although privately Melba considered this a bit harsh. For once, as everyone in town knew, he had been a bright young man with dreams of running a bright and profitable business. Once he'd had hopes of expanding into branch stores in Glowville and Hopsburg and being named Druggist of the Year by grateful citizens of New York State. But after all, Mr. Diggs knew as little about expanding and growing up big as the soft-spoken town in which he had chosen to set up shop. He gave discounts when he should have charged double, and showed no talent for bill collecting, and he could not keep the account books straight. Even at the height of the store's popularity 20 years ago, he was unable to make enough money to keep up with the modern trends. So, when the Super Queen came to town, clean and businesslike and up to date, Mr. Jiggs was in no position to put up a fight. Gradually, customers who had been loyal to Jiggs for years began doing their business at the Super Queen, and gradually Mr. Jiggs, seeing his store withered along with it until he became almost invisible. Day after day he lurked in the shop's back room, strumming, for lack of anything better to do, an old guitar left to him by a musical aunt. His mournful chords grated on Miss Tooney's nerves. "He's got no gumption and never did have," she complained to Melba, when they had become warily acquainted. "And lately he's turned mean. That's what comes of sitting around talking to yourself all day." Melba knew about Mr. Jiggs' meanness. He showed himself rarely, but when he did come forth, a small, balding old man with crumpled yellow skin, he did it in a rage. His fists pounding the air, he shouted at Miss Tooney for not sponging off, and at the cats for being everywhere underfoot, and at the rain for dripping through the roof. When he shouted, his yellow skin turned a terrifying purple, and his eyes bulged like marbles. But after he'd shout, he went away again into the back room and took up his guitar and strummed his long, sad chords. "We don't pay any attention to him," whispered Miss Tooney after he'd gone. This was true. A minute later, even the most nervous and beat-up cats were curled up snoring, and Miss Tooney was sunk deep in a movie magazine, and the rain dripped as hard as ever into buckets. Only Melba sat frozen on her stool, her eyes wobbling a little behind her thick, glassy lenses. Alrighty, folks, that is the first 2 chapters. Tune in next time for the next one. Thanks for watching, everybody. Meow for now.